This video is brought to you by MoviePalette.com and enter ROOM15 for 15% off of your palette. Hey everyone, I am the Blood Guy. Welcome back to another review of a documentary based on a serial killer. And this is one that I've seen before. It came out last year, or just aired last year, January 8th and 9th, 2022 on A&E. Only I didn't see it on A&E when it first came out. I saw it close to when it came out. Someone uploaded it all in one part on YouTube, and then that's where I saw it, and then that's where I watched it again. It's 4 parts, all around an hour long. It adds up to 2 hours, 48 minutes, or at least that's how long it was when I watched it. It's one I would love to have on DVD if it ever got released. It is based on a book that I have, and I have read the book, and it's one of my favorite books on this killer. And I would have to say this is one of the serial killers I am most fascinated by. Yeah, I'm kind of getting over a cold, so please bear with me. I would say this is my second favorite case, second favorite serial killer, whatever, to learn about, read about, watch anything on. And that is Dennis Rader of BTK. And the documentary is BTK Confession of a Serial Killer, which is based on the 2016 book Confession of a Serial Killer by Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who has written, I think she mentions in this that she's written 68 books by this time, has 4 more outlined. So she's written quite a bit. And she's sort of the host of the entire documentary. By the time the book came out, she had been corresponding with Rader for 5 years, and then she worked with him for another 5 years in preparation for the documentary itself. Now, and yes, I did hear the news that BTK, earlier this month, January 2023, did send an email to TMZ about the whole Bryan Kohberger of Idaho thing. Kohberger said that he corresponded with BTK, that he was inspired by him, and that they talked about stuff. So then Rader sent an email to TMZ saying, "I've never talked to the kid, never once spoke to him." Which, if Rader's saying that, it has to be true, because the guy loves admiration. The guy loves attention. He loves any kind of credit. So if he's saying, "I've never spoke to him," then it never happened. But this video is not about that. That could be a topic for a whole other video. So please try to make the comments about the documentary itself. Yes, we all know he came out and said something about Kohberger. So just about the documentary. Now, Dr. Ramsland's pretty much our host. We see her sort of carry us through the entire documentary. We do see her with her interviews with Rader, which is never really an interview. They're more so done over the phone on speaker, like she has her iPhone out on speaker while he's still at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. But I do think that kind of, it adds a couple layers to it, because as I said in my Arthur Shawcross documentary interview with the serial killer, I really like when you can hear the interviewer's questions. I feel like that makes it more intimate. It gives what they're saying a little bit more context. And sort of kind of also acts as like see their reactions to what's being said. So I do like when you can hear the interviewer's questions. But where we never really get footage of him speaking, and it's like he's there, like it's a present day interview, it kind of creates this enigmatic feeling about Rader, which it doesn't glorify him, but it does kind of create this enigma surrounding him. It certainly does not glorify him or his acts. I'll preface by saying it's structured very similarly to Netflix's Conversations with the Killer series. We do kind of bounce around timelines here and there, But it essentially is, when it's not bouncing around, a chronological look at the life and crimes of this certain killer, with a ton of audio uh, from the killer himself, Rader. Tons of photos, tons of old archive footage, whether it be family photos, home movies, whether it be the Rader family or of the victims, news footage of the crimes and around Wichita, tons of interviews with people either in law enforcement or KAKE news, or it's people around Wichita, people that knew the victims or people that knew the Rader family. No one from Rader's family is in this documentary. Like, not even his daughter, Carrie, who I do have her book as well. Aside from Ramsland's book, I do have a few others on Rader. He's just one of the most fascinating to read about, watch about, and I'll get to why. Because it does tie into the whole reason as to why Catherine Ramsland is doing this. So it is very much set up like Conversations with the Killer. Almost feels like it's A&E's version of that. Which, whatever topic they're talking about, we do get audio from Rader on that topic. We really do get firsthand. It also makes it about the victims. Dennis Rader's first attack, January 15th, 1974, on the Otero family. We get an interview with one of these surviving children, Charlie Otero. We get an interview with Steve, I think his name is Relford, who's the son of Shirley Vian, who was one of his victims. Jeff Davis, the son of Dorothy Davis, his final victim. Or Dorothy or a Dolores Davis. I always get it mixed up for some reason. But, we get interviews with the victims, or family members of the victims. We get interviews from this one woman who, she calls herself a survivor, but really she wasn't home when he went to go do his hit. So he just went next door. He went to the next available home. But we get interview with her, tons of law enforcement people. It goes through all the murders. It goes through the silent period between 91 and 2004, how BTK resurfaced, and then the big manhunt, the big cat and mouse game correspondence, and then how he got caught because of the floppy disk, and then sort of what's happened since. And also, Dr. Ramsland takes us on like a tour of Park City in Wichita. She takes us to all these different locations, like where the victims lived, or where they were found, if they were found away from their home, like the final victim who was found under a bridge. And a lot of times she's talking directly to the camera. So when we get audio from Rader, or we get the footage of her interviewing him over the phone, whenever he says his piece, it will then cut to Ramsland looking directly at the camera and sort of psychologically breaking down what he said. Because the whole point of this is not just a documentary, life and crimes of a notorious serial killer. She is trying to take one of the most what's the word I'm looking for? One of the most normal serial killers that there are, and trying to show that serial killers are not always the weirdos, the really suspicious looking ones. They're not the ones that you can spot a mile away. Sometimes it is the family man, the one that volunteers for the Scouts, is a church president, very active in the community, squeaky clean record, someone like Dennis Rader. And there never were any things that could connect him to any of the crimes. But it does go over this one instance where when he killed his final victim, and his alibi was a Scout camping trip for 2 nights. Killed her on the first night, dumped her body. On the second night, he left the camping trip again to go back to the body, do more poses and take pictures. And when he left, he stopped at a truck stop. so he could change out of his hit clothes into his scout uniform. And there was an officer that saw him and was like, hey, there was a crime nearby. I kind of got to talk to everybody. And he was like, oh, I'm volunteering for the scouts. I was just on my way back to the campsite. He's like, oh, okay, you're not the guy we're looking for, so go ahead. And he had Davis's stolen jewelry box in his car. So even though there was no evidence that could link him to any of the crimes, if the cop had just, sort of questioned him or looked through his car, like a proper, canvassing of the area, he probably would have caught BTK. Granted, it was after he killed his final victim, but still, would have caught him 14 years earlier. So, and that ties into what Ramsland's been saying, and really the whole point of this documentary, and kind of the point of the book, is, just because someone looks normal, or has a completely vanilla, boring, mundane, just extraordinarily ordinary life, doesn't mean they should be cast aside from suspicion. There is no mold or even the light's going crazy now. There is no mold or stereotype to serial killers. If you have to canvass an area, canvass the area. And that's why she's breaking, like, every time Rader says something, she breaks it down for us. And she's very good at her job. I thought that was some of the more fascinating elements of this whole documentary. Because even when he says, like, she'll ask him, if you came home and someone did this to your wife, how would you feel? And he pretty much just says, oh, I'd be very upset. I guess it would be karma coming back to get me. And then when she's looking at the camera, she says, well, he's kind of saying he doesn't have any real empathy. Because, when I ask him that and he says it's karma, he's looking at how his family's deaths would affect him directly. So even if he says something completely, seemingly normal, she breaks it down for us like, well, this is why he's whatever. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And why BTK is so fascinating to me is because these family man serial killers have always been the most fascinating to me. Ones that do have the normal family life, that do blend into society perfectly, are very active in the community and are very well known, yet they have this completely just extreme way of compartmentalization. I find those to be the scariest and the most fascinating. And I do think BTK is kind of the poster boy for that kind of serial killer. Another thing it goes into is all these sort of Dennis Rader, BTK isms. He doesn't really call it compartmentalization. He calls it cubing. It goes into what cubing is. It goes into, what he calls projects, or in all his different projects, like Foxhole, Blackout, Piano. It goes into hidey holes, what he calls hidey holes. Hotel parties, which is something he would do to stave off his urges during his silent periods. How he did his stalking phase, or his casting phase, stalking phase, all his different phases. And it goes all the way back to his obsession with, like, Harvey Glatman back in the late 60s, or the Clutter family massacre in the late 60s. So it goes all the way back to his earliest memories of having these fantasies with bondage and fear and trying to suck in all the fear and helplessness of a victim. And he takes Ramsland all the way back with that, and then she breaks it down for us. I thought this was a very good documentary. It is very dramatization heavy. I mean, you do get a lot of footage, news footage, archive footage, whatever. But the dramatization isn't, like, heavy or over the top, even for, like, an A&E special or series. Even the dramatizations are very much like Conversations with the Killer, you'll kind of just see like an actor's hand or feet, or be like back to, shrouded by shadow. You never get to see their face, usually obscured or out of focus. You know, like when she talks about seeing himself on the news, you'll kind of like see a hand on an armchair like this over the TV remote, or see like the back of his head as he's watching TV. So the dramatizations aren't extravagant, but they do kind of help put some kind of a visual to it. Because I'm not too big on dramatizations. Ones like this are okay. You know, like Conversation with the Killer, Jeffrey Dahmer tapes. It was always some obvious blonde guy with glasses sitting at the interrogation table, but always out of focus. Maybe you see for like here down or like here up. Those kinds of dramatizations are okay, and that's really all this does. But it's very in depth on the psychological side. I mean, it goes pretty in depth with all 10 murders, uh, really into the investigation, get a lot of insight from people, you know, different family members, law enforcement members, people that work for KETV. Uh, it is a shame, like, I know his family has completely written him off, but, you know, Carrie has written a book, she's been on TV. It would have been nice to get some kind of 2 cents from her, but, you know, Dr. Ramsland did a very good job at trying to take the mind of Dennis Rader and try to explain it to us. And, you know, with any kind of question she asked him, breaking down the psychology of all his answers. And I thought she worked as a really good host, if you will, of this whole series. Whether it be her taking us on this tour of Park City and Wichita, or even when she's just sitting there not looking at the camera and just talking on the phone to Dennis, or if she's looking directly at the camera, sort of breaking down the psychology of his answers. I thought she did a great job. She keeps it fascinating. She keeps it intriguing. Explains it in a very interesting way. And I also commend the whole reason why she's doing this. You know, whether it be the book or the documentary itself, she she isn't just trying to spell out the motives and reasons of BTK as, you know, sort of making him her project. You know, she really does want both the public and law enforcement to be like, there are normal looking, normal acting people out there that can do these things, and they should also be looked at. You know, serial killers are not, you know, this person. They could also be this normal person. And that's really the whole point of both the book and the documentary. So I really commend the whole reason for her doing it. And I would say she succeeded, because it does a great job at showing Dennis Rader's normal life, but then putting in all these interviews where she breaks down, you know, how he's this psychopathic, completely, you know, lack of empathy, lack of remorse, guy who loves attention, loves all the credit in the world. Even breaking down things like when he was a compliance officer, he wants everyone else to follow the rules completely so that he can break his own rules or break the rules at large. So it kind of balances. You know, she breaks down almost every avenue possible of this guy's mind. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating, all 3 hours of it. So, yeah, I think it's very, very good. You can find it on YouTube. In its entirety, it's 4 parts that add up to just under 3 hours. And, you know, like I said earlier, take Netflix's Conversation with the Serial Killer, like the Tapes series, but make it sort of hosted by this forensic psychiatrist that knows her shit very well and breaks down the psychology of everything for the viewer in a very easy to understand non-boring, very intriguing, very interesting, and very understandable way. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. I've always been fascinated by BTK, and I would say this is one of the better documentaries that I've seen of, on him. Whether it be just in general, his life and crimes, but also just with this sort of psychoanalytical angle to it. So I highly recommend it. I thought it was very, very good. One of the better documentaries I've seen outside of Netflix's Tapes series. So definitely go check it out. So with that, I guess we'll get into the summary and then the long list of notes that I still haven't learned my lesson. The notes of everything that this docuseries covers. So as always, I like to give a brief summary on the killer that the film or documentary is based on. Dennis Rader, known for 30 years before his capture as BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill, is one of America's most notorious serial killers, holding Wichita, Kansas in fear from 1974 to 1991, killing 10 people and sending taunting letters to police and news media, which is where he came up with his self-appointed moniker. He went silent after his final murder in 1991, but the letters came back in 2004 after it was announced that a book would be written about BTK, and it was his desire to strike fear again and control the narrative of his own story. Rader was apprehended when he sent a floppy disk, being told it was okay to send, and it was traced back to his church. Rader was a shock to many people in Kansas and the world, as he was completely normal looking like anybody's dad. He was a devoted family man, a church president, a volunteer for the Scouts, a compliance officer, and during his murder spree, he worked for ADT Home Security, which aided him in his stalking and ability to enter homes. Rader was a very meticulous predator, having what he called projects. Women he would stalk and vet for weeks or up to months, then break in, cut the phone line, and would bind the victims, take photos, take in their fear and helplessness, and then strangle them. His first attack was a family with 2 parents and 2 small children. He would also take clothes and jewelry as trophies and hide them in random places in Wichita that he called hidey holes. A lifelong studier and fan of serial killers, he always attributed his urges to what he called Factor X. During his silent periods, Rader would dress up in his victim's clothes and wear a very eerie-looking women's mask and bondage, and then take photos of himself in order to emulate his victims and satisfy his urges. He was always very forthcoming and open about his crimes and pled guilty to all 10 murders. The notion of the killer next door, family man, community man, serial killer has been the focus of many studies to break the stereotypes of how killers are seen and thought of. It has inspired numerous films and television, both non-fictional about him and fictional, most notably the Trinity Killer from Dexter. He is still alive today and as of 2023 has retired from correspondence to writers, but continues his artwork. In January 2023, Rader wrote an email to TMZ denying claims that Idaho killer Brian Kohlberger had ever corresponded with him. And so now we get into the long list of things that the documentary covers. I am really seriously trying to make these lists shorter so that the video can be shorter, but again, I find all of it interesting and I want to make note of all of it. But I am trying. So, episode 1 is called Outliers, which, if I remember correctly, is what Ramsland calls sort of these kinds of serial killers, ones outside the mold, outside the stereotype. Starts off with news audio of the 30th anniversary of BTK's first victim, which of course was January 15th, 1974, the murder of the Oteros, 4 members of the Oteros, with shots of around the Park City area and footage of the press conference where the guy says, bottom line, BTK has been arrested, which that was on February 25th, 2005. News articles of BTK murders and interviews of the fear he struck for 30 years and people just not being able to wait, seeing him, like, we finally get to see the guy, and then snippets of people being like, that's him, that's BTK, because he's so normal looking. And then we're finally introduced to Catherine Ramsland, and she kind of briefs us on her history with Dennis Rader. She says she's corresponded with him for 10 years. I think the first 5 was in preparation for this, and then 5 more for the documentary. Professor of forensic psychology, and sets out to understand him as much as possible, and how this is the first time he's gone into this kind of detail with someone. And so then that's kind of the intro, and I think that's actually like the intro for a few of these episodes. So then it says part 1, Outliers. So then we go to Wichita, Kansas, and Dr. Ramsland on how she studied serial killers for over 30 years. How John Collins, the original co-ed killer of Ann Arbor, Michigan, terrorized her area when she was young, from 1967 to 69. You get news footage of him, her history of becoming a forensic psychiatrist, how she's written 68 books, has 4 more planned. I have a handful of them. I definitely want to get more of her books. I really like her writing style, and she definitely knows her stuff. Continues to study extreme offenders. We get other experts interviewed saying how she's one of the leading experts in the country. It goes into the media attention of how he didn't fit this serial killer stereotype, and then how she came to correspond with him. And the first thing he did was make her solve codes. He sent her all these letters with clues and sort of puzzles that she had to solve. How she did. And then we're introduced to Ray London of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation on how understanding Rader can lead to understanding many other serial killers. Some of the interviewees from Wichita, like former TV anchor, a former editor for Wichita Eagle, they go into Wichita itself, like small town values, nice people. Dr. Ramsland on his childhood shows her going to some of the areas of his childhood, which she says was actually a request from Dennis Rader. He said, if you want to understand, you got to go to these places. So she did. Audio of Dennis from his cell on how he stays busy. Every time we get audio from Dennis, it's always from this same phone call or same series of phone calls. It doesn't always show her talking to him on speakerphone, but it is all from the same series of phone call interviews. But he says how he stays in his cell. He looks at cracks in the walls. He looks for figures in the cracks. Looks for monsters. Thinks of himself as a monster. And we do get like examples of his artwork, which this is a piece that he sent me in the second letter that I received from him. This is a donut fish. But there's like a drawing of him kind of done as a monster. We do get a few of his drawings on screen, which also one thing I did forget to mention that I actually thought was kind of interesting. Each time we get like a news article of a BTK murder, it's done on like, we'll get like a silo or a water tower or an old barn, and like the letters of the article will be like on the side of it or like going up the silo, which I thought that was interesting. So Ramsland on how the number one rule is to not be judgmental, but knowing how you can be manipulated. So then Ramsland takes us back to 1974 when Dennis Rader's 28 years old, kills the Otero family. We're introduced to Bob Smizer, who is a former friend of Rader. He goes into Dennis returning from the Air Force in 1970. Audio of Dennis on getting married and love, which Dr. Ramsland breaks down how psychopaths can feel things, contrary to popular belief, but the feelings they feel are very shallow and not very understood. So it's like a very base feeling. Um, audio of Dennis of how he got laid off from Cessna, which was like a dream job of his. I think it was building helicopters. And that led him to his first break-in out of frustration against the system. Larry Thomas, retired assistant director and part of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and the BTK task force on organized and unorganized offenders, how Rader fits in perfectly with the organized offender. It goes into the low crime rate of Wichita. And then we're introduced to Charlie Otero. And these are some of the more interesting interviews of the series, apart from Dr. Ramsland herself, is the family members recounting their memories of either when Rader came to their home or how they found out. Charlie Otero was not home. He's one of 3 siblings that were at school when his parents, Joseph and Julie, were home, and his younger siblings, I think Joseph Jr. and Josephine, aged 9 and 11, or 8 and 11, were killed. So we talked to him. He goes into, where was I? He goes into great detail on how he came home and found everyone. We get photos and footage of the scene and the police there. Audio of Dennis on turning the thermostat up, which Ramsland explains that speeds up the process of decomposition, so it makes placing the time of death even more difficult. DNA found on and around Josephine was saved because, due to the lack of the scientific ability to use DNA, and that's something that will come back 30 years later. And how the lack of stolen items meant it was solely for the sexual gratification and murder, or of murder. And then footage of different kinds of police work. Dr. Ramsland takes us to the Otero house, interviewing an old Wichita anchor, Larry Hatterberg, from that time about that day. We get more news footage. Him on working the scene back then, how a crime like this never happened in Wichita. News footage and audio. Dennis on how he spotted and targeted Julie Otero, and goes into his original plan. And you can even hear in the things he says, sort of the lack of empathy. Like, he even says how, actually put down the quote, Mr. Otero messes up the whole formula because he wasn't expecting him to be home. So then how he improvised, what he did, Ramsland on, and Dennis on explaining cubing. Now, this is one of the examples when it explains sort of a BTK-ism, or like a Rader-ism. Of course, it means compartmentalization, but he always calls it cubing, which is you have a cube, and on one side you have Dennis Rader, the student at Wichita State University, husband, stalker, killer, father, and at different times he can switch off and switch on a different side of that cube. It's basically his way of explaining compartmentalization, which that is juxtaposed to photos and footage of Dennis at Carrie's wedding and portraits and photos of his masks and hotel parties, which it will get into those as well. Goes into the impact and size of the story uh, initially, and then it makes comparisons to the Clutter family murders in Holcomb, Kansas, 1959, by Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. Home invasion, uh, 4 members bound and killed. A radio was stolen, which, even though there was a lack of things taken from the Oteros, he did take a radio, sort of as Dr. Ramsland puts it, solidarity with the two guys of the Clutter murders, Smith and Hickok. Dennis, on hearing about the story when he was 14 and he read about them, and he was intrigued by the bondage aspect. Dr. Ramsland on how most killers are not creative, especially Rader. Most read or hear something somewhere and then want to do it, and now that he's done it, he has to do it again. Which then Dennis goes into Catherine Bright, how he chose her. He watched her for about a month. So then it says April 4th, 1974. It goes into the murder of Catherine Bright. We're introduced, excuse me, to Arlen Smith, who's a retired lieutenant for Wichita PD on the events just prior. Neither Kevin stayed. Oh, and how Kevin stayed the night so that they could go shopping the next day, and how they went shopping. We get photos of them. How the brother Kevin was not expected by Rader. He thought it was just going to be Catherine Bright. 2005 news interview with Kevin Bright on their altercation. Then it goes into how Kevin was shot, but he got away, and then Catherine was killed. Which Kevin was shot in the head and still managed to make it out the door and to go get help. Dennis on stabbing her, and then him and Dr. Ramsland on how stabbing wasn't his MO. It was more out of panic and improvisation. Dennis on feeling like a serial killer after Bright, because she asked him, like, when did you feel like a serial killer? And he said after Catherine Bright. Dr. Ramsland on Dennis's earliest fantasies, which he would go to barns and farmhouses. She's at barns and farmhouses, and then her going to them as per his request. His silo of terror, she goes to the silo, and then it shows the illustration that he sent her about having this pretty much, a silo where each level or room had some sort of torture bondage room. Dennis, on the first time he got aroused by bondage, which was playing cowboys and Indians with some of the neighborhood kids. But then we go to episode 2, which is called Unmasking Factor X, which Rader has always called Factor X, that the voice or part of his brain that makes him kill. The urge is what he's always called Factor X. So, Wichita, Kansas, footage of the Bright and Otero scenes. Dennis on how he followed the news very closely, how some people were in custody, but he didn't like that. Well, this isn't his audio, but it goes into how I think 3 people were in custody as suspects. BTK did not like that because they were getting credit. So then it goes into the phone call made to the Wichita Eagle in October of 74, saying that a letter can be found in a textbook at the library, and then it shows pictures of the letter and the textbook it was found in, and how the letter broke down the crimes and says BTK, signs it BTK. Then it goes into Dennis coming up with BTK. Ramsland on attention being a driving force and how monikers generates attention. We're introduced to Sherry Chisenhall, who was a former editor, on how they withheld the letter and the fact that a serial killer was at large. at the request of police as to not cause panic. Uh, Dennis on Factor X and how it's still there. He still hears, that voice or still gets those urges. Dr. Ramsden on how Factor X is the source of blame and his urges, and how if we can't figure him out or figure out Factor X, he's more special. But if we can, then he's not. X is just his urges. So he kind of makes it sound bigger than it really is. Like it's more deeper and more complicated than it really is. That's kind of what she says. Dennis goes into detail of his father, how he looked up to him. Ramsden on how not all serial killers suffer from abuse. We go back to 1945. Goes into his birth, his childhood, how he never matured past the infantile need for attention. Dennis on the genesis of his dark side, which was the story of his mother vacuuming. And she was reaching into the cushions of the couch, and her wedding ring got caught on a spring. And he was actually aroused by that. He was aroused by the fact that she was trapped and the look of fear and panic and helplessness on her face. That was sort of the start of everything. Along with playing cowboys and Indians, that's when the bondage aspect came in. And then that led to trapping and hanging cats. How the first fantasy victim was his 5th grade teacher, and then peeping on her and then tying himself up. Which he also goes into, he didn't just hang cats. He made these very sort of like the box and the stick trap. He made those, but like with a little hole for the head to come out, which then he would tie up. So everything was very intricate with him. He always did more meticulous ways of doing things. Dr. Ramsden on paraphilias, how they're basically just deviant sexual attractions or fetishes. So then we go to 1976, the belief, which they said that BTK has been silent for like a year and a half or so. The belief that BTK died, moved, or was arrested for something else. But he had started a family, moved to the Park City suburb, and he worked at ADT Home Security, which actually helped him out a lot when it came to getting into houses and how to figure out security and how to get into houses. So then Dennis on working for ADT and how he'd steal clothes, locking in on a target, go into naming projects. Ramsden on how naming his projects or finding a victim, calling them a project, then naming that project, it dehumanizes them. So she goes into that. March 17th, 77, going door to door of his projects. No one was home that day, or at least the ones that he wanted. So then we're introduced to Steve Relford, who is the son of Shirley Vian. And he goes into how he had just turned 6 and what happened the day BTK came to his house, which at first he saw just a man knocking on all these doors. He went to go run an errand. He was coming home. BTK stopped him, showed him a picture. Like, do you know this lady? He answered him. Then he went home. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and BTK just went right in. Put some toys and blankets in the bathroom. Put the kids in there. But Steve could see through the crack in the door, and he saw that he had bound her with tape, plastic bag on her head, rope around her neck, and he saw that he had killed her. He goes into great detail with it. He and other interviewees on the impact it had on Steve. Ramsden on the lack of empathy towards the children in all these cases, despite having kids of his own. Dennis on how the kids and their welfare didn't really matter to him. Excuse me. he was locked in on the victims. That's all he could think about. So anything happened to the kids, he didn't care about. Dennis on rape being his number one taboo. He never technically raped anybody. Uh, he always said he masturbated on or near the bodies. But then he goes right into knots. Like his favorite knot being the clove hitch knot. Then there was another one that was like a double slip knot, which is why, side note, the IFC film The Clove Hitch Killer, it's fictional, but very, very, very closely based on BTK. Probably one of the best BTK films without being about BTK. Very good film. It goes into bondage being a major part of the fantasy, experimenting with different knots and ligatures, taking trophies that can be used for bondage, uh, like pantyhose, scarves, uh, his idolization of other serial killers. Dennis on studying killers since he was 14, starting with Harvey Glattman, who of course was the Lonely Heart Killer. And then it goes into Glattman a little bit with photos, footage, how his main MO was to pose as a photographer, and he would take photos of these young women or girls, but then the photos started incorporating bondage, and they started getting more and more dark. But once he had them in the bondage, then it was all over. And there are photos where the look of fear in the photos is genuine, and that's sort of what Dennis locked onto when he was studying Harvey Glattman. How he always tried to replicate the fear seen in those photos. So we go to December 8th, 77, the murder of Nancy Fox. How she was already in the house. How he was already in the house when she came home. He had broken in numerous times. That was another thing he would do. He'd break in. He'd, touch the clothes. He would just walk around. He, at first, comforted, her with the "I just want to do these things. I'm not going to hurt you" ruse. I'm pretty sure with her he used the "I'm an escaped convict. All I need is money, car, and some time to get away. But first, I want to do these things." It doesn't mention it, but I'm pretty sure that's what he did with her. Dennis had the look of fear being part of the arousal, and how even though her face was down, the thought of it being done was enough, at least in the case of Nancy Fox. And how this was his favorite project because it was the first time everything had gone to plan. There were no surprises. Everything went the way it was supposed to. And he wanted the recognition, so he called it in. We actually get audio of that call, of when Rader called from a payphone saying there's a murder at this address. So that news footage of the crime scene. Dennis on the call being stupid and thinking that he could be ID'd. Dr. Ramsland on how he thought he'd get caught numerous times, but when he didn't, it validates in his mind that he's special or smarter and superior. That former anchor of Hatterberg on the Nancy Fox letter, and how it said, "How many people do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper?" News footage from KAKE when they first used BTK in a broadcast. And then Dennis on finally getting recognized, say how it was a huge high for him. Then Ramsland talks about that. So we get to part 3, which is called Keeping Secrets. We're in Park City. Dennis on the photos of himself with photos. Ramsland on how that eased the urge to kill, yet still immersed him in his fantasy world. Now, it's not quite the hotel parties yet. This is when he was still doing it at home. His wife Paula did catch him a couple times, so that was when he started doing these things in hotels when he was on trips. Which he would wear this creepy mask, a wig. He would actually wear the clothes of the victims that the stolen clothes, and then wrap himself up in bondage, tie himself up, tape himself up, and then take photos of himself to help uh, emulate the look of the victims. So he wasn't quite doing it at hotels yet. He was still doing it at home. Ramsland on how Rader differs from other sexual killers as he took long breaks. The serial killer was... the whole serial killer was more of an identity thing for Rader. And he could help himself, it's just that he didn't. So it's not that a serial killer was really ingrained into him. It's like he really wanted to be a serial killer, and he could help his urges. He just chose not to. And this is put to footage of Ted Bundy, Kenneth Bianchi, and John Wayne Gacy. November 1978, letters sent to Rochester, New York, and through Xerox traced back to the basement of Wichita State University and the second story of the library, which is where the letter in the textbook was found. Dennis on being scared that they're closing in on him. Dennis and Dr. Ramsland on hidey holes. And it explains what that is with photos, which was all these different areas, whether it be his house, his shed, old farmhouses, old areas out in the middle of nowhere, where he hid his trophies, his journals, his project books, photographs, dolls that he had made to look up, like Nancy Fox and other victims. He hid them in these certain areas, or like cars and junkyards that had been there forever, hiding them like in the trunk. So he called them hidey holes, and it goes into that. And then it shows a never-before-seen map of all the hidey holes in Wichita and Park City that he made for Dr. Ramsland. Then it goes into how BTK vanished in 1979. Dennis on Carrie being born in 78. Him graduating in 79. Not really having time to have any projects. But he still stalked. And he still used like magazine cutouts and cards to masturbate to. Which Larry Thomas of the BTK task force and Steve Osborne, who was Rader's chief public defender, goes into this as well. Which he would get like these crime magazines, cut faces out of them, put them onto these index cards. Then on the back of them, he would create these profiles, like, Kathy Smith likes, she's a student, likes music, cooking, doesn't like, dogs, loud cars, fears this, and that. And would actually, like, put it in the passenger seat, drive around, talk to it, would use it in the shower to masturbate to, just as his family was coming home. So he was still immersing himself in the fantasy world. And this is put to Rader family photos. Then it goes into the hotel parties, which Dennis and Ramsland go into that. Which Dennis on getting caught twice by Paula and saying, if you keep this up, I'm going to take the kids and we're going to leave. Dennis goes into suicide and suicidal thoughts that he had. Then Ramsland to Dennis on a dream he wrote about to her, which also hotel parties was him dressing up, taking photos, but in a hotel. And this dream was about being caught for more murders. And then Ramsland on the possibility of there being more than just 10. Which I put died to out-state trips. Oh, due to out-of-state trips. She thinks there might be more in other states. But Dennis, he confirms that 10 is the final victim count. And I do believe that, Dennis Rader, with loving attention as much as he does, and getting all the credit that he could possibly get, I really don't think there's any more murders in other states. Uh, Dr. Ramsland, driving by the former home of 53-year-old Maureen Hedge, which Dennis on how he chose her, which uh, Hedge was a neighbor of his, and he talked about how he saw her every day, would always wave to her, and you know this was very risky because it was a neighbor. It now puts him, just in the vicinity constantly of the crime scene. But April 27th of 85, it goes into the murder of Maureen Hedge. After 7 years of silence, he kills a neighbor. How he, as the scout leader, planned a camping trip, left as they all slept, and then drove to her home, broke in, waited in the closet. Dennis, on hiding and waiting for her, then took her to his church, posed her, took photos, and then disposed of her. It goes into him becoming more cocky, disorganized, and changing. We're introduced to David Zickel, former Park City Police Department, on getting the call to do a wellness check on her because no one had heard from her. And then news footage of her search. Dennis on being the president of the church, yet using it to commit these acts and not seeing anything wrong with it. It goes into how BTK never claimed her or sent letters or phone calls because she was a neighbor. He didn't really want her to be connected, just yet. And then it goes into how he picked Vicky Wagerly. September 16th, 1986 goes into the murder of Vicky Wagerly. Dennis on how it wasn't his usual casting, which I think means, before stalking, there's casting, how he picks the ones to sort of start stalking. But he used the telephone man ruse, goes into the details of him in the home, then her husband finding her, news footage of the murder, how the husband was a suspect, but it went cold. No one suspected that it was BTK related. Dennis is asked by Ramsland, what if he came home and found his wife? He said he'd be upset, and I guess it would be karma. So Ramsland chalking it up to no real empathy, just seeing how it affects him. January 19th, 91, the murder of Dolores Davis. Dr. Ramsland standing on the bridge that she was found under. Jeff Davis, her son, is interviewed. He goes into her as a person, as a mother, with photos of her in her house. There was this other camping trip, scout camping trip, a 2-night trip, which he established for an alibi. How he then left the camping trip again, broke in, used the escaped convict ruse, took her under the bridge, posed and photographed her, killed and disposed of her. Dennis and Ramsland on how he left camp the next night, went back to the body. Then on the way back, he stopped at a truck stop to change from his hit clothes into his scout uniform. And he was actually stopped by a cop who questioned him because, he had to canvass the whole area. But, and Rader had her stolen jewelry box in his car, but he explained how, I'm a scout volunteer, I'm on my way back to the campsite. And the cop's like, it's okay, you're clearly not the guy we're looking for, and let him go. So, Ramsland on that cop's error as he adhered to the suspicious-looking stereotype of serial killers, and, had he canvassed everyone that the way he was supposed to, he could have caught BTK sooner. Granted, all 10 of his victims were dead at that point, but still could have caught him 14 years earlier. And it goes into how Davis wasn't initially attributed to BTK. No evidence was found. So then the last episode, episode 4, is called Walking Cesspool because of a quote during the victim testimonies during the trial. Ramsland on being given his project list, which is his detailed list of potential and completed projects with names, dates, entries of when and where he saw them, if he ever interacted with them, whether to continue or abort the project. Incredibly detailed. Uh, Dennis on saying he had about 55 projects going on. It mentions project number 16, Blackout, but then we're introduced to Cheryl Gilmore Sarkozy, BTK survivor, and Project Blackout. January 91. Dennis on being the family man, church president, scout volunteer, working for the community, but still prowling, saying that he did have control over himself, but and Blackout referring to a bar near Wichita State that he would go to while he was a student. So then we jump back to 1977. Sarkozy goes into her life at that time with photos, how she met a man at the Blackout bar. They had a conversation about suicide. She talked about, suicide, how people should have that choice. And he, held her hand and was like, oh, don't say that. People care about you. And then left. But how, in reality, he followed her home, stalked her without her knowing. And then Dennis on how he was ready to kill, but she wasn't home. And how her neighbor was Shirley Vian. So, then Sarkozy on police telling her that her neighbor was killed, but how her son, Steve, saw the man knocking on all these doors, including Sarkozy's, and putting together that she was the intended victim of BTK that day. She just happened not to be home, and he went to a different house. So then, go back to 1991, Rader working as a Park City compliance officer with footage, and how the job gave him an ability to watch over and stalk people, but also put him in complete control. It goes into how he would give people fines for the grass being like a centimeter too tall, dogs barking, which there was even a case when he took this woman's dog for barking or not being on a leash, and then he ignored her phone calls to try to get him back, and the dog was put down. Just, he loved that control, which Dennis goes in, audio of Dennis going into being a compliance officer. It goes into the complaints that he got. Ramsland goes into how he keeps everyone in compliance so he can break the rules so that, it sort of evens out. So then we skip all the way to January 15th, 2004. 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, how a book is going to be written on BTK. Of course, they don't have all the facts of BTK because there were 3 murders that weren't even attributed to him. And how BTK did not like that, so he writes another letter, including photos and a copy of Vicki Wegerle's ID, which finally links her to BTK, which has more photos, and how fear was struck back into Wichita. Footage of the press conference with Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, Wichita Police Homicide Commander, saying that the letter is BTK. May 10th, 2004, the task force is formed. News footage of his return. How profilers came in and helped script these press conferences to sound enticing to BTK to make him want to respond and keep talking. And how it worked. Which Dennis on that, and thinking how they were having this friendship, this correspondence. It goes into the letter sent to KAKE TV, outlining his story by chapter names, because he wants to be in control of the narrative of his own story, hinting that there may be more murders at the very end. Not that there's more murders out there, but that there could be more to come. The word search that he sent to KAKE TV, and then it actually shows Ramsland with Susan Peters, the anchor at that time, sort of helping her solve this word search. Or not helping her solve it, but showing her what each word means, and how he even put his address in there. Uh, January 5th, or January 2005, it goes into the cereal box package left in the pickup bed at a Home Depot, and but how and why they didn't get that box. The guy came to the truck, saw it, threw it away, or burnt it. How they had to set up a new thing. But they looked at the surveillance footage at the Home Depot, and they saw a guy put the box in the truck, then go to a Jeep Cherokee. So now they're looking for Jeep Cherokees. It does show the footage. Larry Thomas on BTK asking about a floppy disk and if it's okay to send one, and how they lied and said it's okay to send. Dennis on being nervous but thinking that they might be honest with him, Scout's honor. And how it was traced back to the Christ Lutheran Church under the name Dennis. Dennis being put under surveillance as they now have they have to put him under surveillance because they don't have DNA yet to link him. But the saved DNA from the Oteros and Nancy Fox is now used. Goes into how they got a court order for Wichita State, got the records of his daughter Carrie, saw that she had a pap smear, so they got those samples, which of course, lit, and it said she's the offspring of BTK. So then February 25th, 2005, the arrest of Dennis Rader. And we get, the helicopter footage of the arrest, how he was pulled over and arrested, how the first thing he said was, "Would you tell my wife I won't be home for lunch?" The initial interview process, which also goes into how once he got put in the back of the van, they're like, "Mr. Rader, do you know why we picked you up?" And he just says, "I have an idea why." The initial interview process, footage of that interview, and his reaction to the floppy disk, which is, "Why did you lie to me?" Dennis on how they should have respected him more, and their cat and mouse game, and how he's still mad about it. Or how they should have lied, and then Dr. Ramsland on how he's still mad about it. Dennis on how he confessed after they mentioned DNA, because there's no escaping DNA. He thought that was the end of the line. It mentions Paula's reaction, which, complete sadness, a denial, you've got the wrong guy. Interview footage of Carrie on her reaction. I think it was like a morning show. She talks about her reaction. Susan Peters on her reaction, and then news footage of Steve Relford's reaction, as well as Charlie Otero's. And then Thomas on being told where his collections were. So then June 27th, 2000, it shows how they went to the compliance office, his, cabinets where he had some of his collections, how they found all this evidence, showing pictures of it, including Barbies tied to PVC pipe, photos of all little miniatures of his victims with their IDs and jewelry. So June 27th, 2005, Rader's trial, with footage of him pleading guilty, victim statements, including Jeff Davis calling him a walking cesspool. Goes into Paula's emergency divorce, and how she was never interviewed, stayed out of the public light. Shows the last news footage of Rader in his red jumpsuit. And then Ramsland on how Dennis is different, not the stereotype, and how we have to learn from people like him to spot future ones early on and catch them, like Rader would have been if we did just focus on the mold or the stereotype. So that's BTK, Confessions of a Serial Killer, based on the book of the same name. This might be the best documentary on BTK. Of course, there's a ton out there on him. But this one is a good mixture of the Conversations with a Serial Killer tapes on Netflix where it's the story of BTK, but with a very well done psychological breakdown by uh, Dr. Ramsland, just about how Rader works and thinks. Now, of course, we're never going to fully understand BTK or serial killers for that matter, but I think this one does a really good job at sort of breaking down Dennis Rader to uh, the best that she can and breaking it down to the easiest to understand way. I thought it was very enlightening. I mean, as I've said before, I'm pretty well read in the story of BTK, but this really helped shed a lot of light on the psychological aspect of it, and I really enjoyed this docu series. I think this is one of the better, if not the best ones on BTK, and so I highly recommend it and the book. Um, I know I watched it for free on YouTube. It's all in one long video, about 2 hours, 48 minutes. So definitely check it out and check out Dr. Ramsland's book, as well as other books by Dr. Ramsland. I really liked it. So there's a bunch of other serial killer documentaries and films that I'll be getting to. I think the next one I'll get to is The Ripper on Netflix, about the Yorkshire Ripper. So stay tuned for that, and thank you for watching.